My name is Daniel Grant. I'm 47 years old, a father, a husband, and the only one in my family who still believes dignity should mean something. I grew up in a house where power was mistaken for love, and silence was the currency of survival. I broke that cycle when I had my daughter, Eliza. She's 12, bright, a little too curious for her own good, and she's got a voice that fills a room. That voice has always reminded me that I did one thing right in this world, raising her to never be afraid of who she is. It was supposed to be a family celebration. My parents' 50th anniversary. I'd rented the venue, paid for the food, the decor, even flew in relatives they hadn't seen in decades. I did it all for them, even though I've spent years being their afterthought. Eliza was walking around handing out little thank you cards. She'd made herself loudly, excitedly, with that usual spark in her, and then it happened. My brother Paul stood up, red-faced, and in front of everyone slapped her across the face. The sound cracked across the room like a gunshot. Time froze. Eliza's hand shot to her cheek, eyes wide with betrayal, not just from him, but from the room that stayed still. She looked at me. Not crying, just confused. And that's what shattered me. Not the slap, not even Paul's booming laugh after it, but the look my daughter gave me, like, will you protect me now, or will you pretend this didn't happen like they always do? And then came the words. Paul sneered, looked around the stunned crowd, and said loud enough for every guest to hear, like mother, like daughter, both useless. He laughed like it was the best joke of the night. My dad chuckled, sipped his scotch, and added, well, she needed to learn some shame. I remember that moment in complete silence, as if my hearing had turned off just so my heart could break more clearly. Everyone looked to me then, expecting the usual Daniel the peacemaker, Daniel the silent brother, Daniel who knows how to keep the family together, but not this time. I looked at Eliza, her cheek red, her soul humiliated, and something in me, the part that always kept the peace, died. What they didn't know, though, was that the mic Paul had used to give his speech 5 minutes earlier was still on, connected to the room's surround system. Every word, every insult, every cruel laugh, it had echoed through the speakers, loud and clear, for everyone in that hall to hear. And that, right there, was the moment I decided I wasn't going to save the family this time. After the event, everyone scattered like startled birds. Some pretended nothing had happened. Others looked at the floor when they passed me. But a few approached quietly, guests, colleagues, even distant cousins, whispering words like unacceptable and how could he do that to her. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The wheels had already started turning in my mind. For once, I wasn't going to forget. I wasn't going to bury this to protect people who thought humiliation was tradition. That night, Eliza curled up next to me on the couch. She didn't cry. That almost hurt more. Children are supposed to cry when they're hurt. But she just stared at the wall and whispered, "Is he allowed to do that, Dad?" My throat burned. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw a chair across the room. But I just held her and said, "No, sweetheart, he's not. And he's not going to get away with it." She nodded. One tear fell. That was enough for me to carry a lifetime of resolve. You see, Paul's always been the golden one. My parents' favorite, the one who could do no wrong. Even when he was stealing from my college fund, lying about business deals, or cheating on his third wife. The problem is, Paul thinks protection is the same as immunity, and for decades he's been right. But not anymore, because while he was busy living on applause and arrogance, I was building something stronger: reputation, trust, and quiet influence. What they didn't know was that I had friends in that room, people I'd helped professionally, journalists, lawyers, board members, People who had once asked me for favors and never forgot that I showed up when no one else would. I started making calls, not with rage, with precision. I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted to reveal him. I also began journaling everything. Every comment, every past slight, every memory where he hurt someone and laughed about it later. Not because I needed to relive the pain, but because I needed the story to be complete. I didn't want this to be about one slap. I wanted it to expose the rot that had been hidden under our family's surface for years. The slap wasn't the beginning. It was the final symptom. I waited a few days before speaking to anyone in the family. I let the silence thicken. My parents didn't call. They never did when Paul did something cruel. It was always up to me to let things go, but I had no intention of doing that this time. I was going to let Paul's words do the damage. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to let the truth walk in, through a door he left wide open. A week passed. I stayed quiet, but behind the scenes, I was building a structure around that moment. Slowly, carefully, I asked the venue manager for a copy of the audio recording. It was standard practice, they said, to record events for archival or promotional use. When I received the file, I listened again. It was all there: Paul's slap, his degrading words, my father's chilling approval, the guests' hushed discomfort. I didn't flinch this time. I just labeled it evidence. I wasn't interested in public humiliation for the sake of revenge. I wasn't trying to cancel anyone. I was building something cleaner, smarter. My daughter deserved that. I had one quiet goal: make sure no one ever trusted Paul again to represent anything, whether it was a company, a board, or even this family's name. The man they defended in private would be exposed in public, using only his own voice. My hands would stay clean, my face calm. Paul worked for a mid-sized consulting firm. He was their face for corporate ethics and leadership training, if you can believe the irony. I contacted a former client of his, a woman who once confided in me about how Paul berated her during a pitch. I asked if she'd be willing to write a statement, truthfully, about what she'd experienced. She agreed. She wasn't afraid anymore. Turns out many others weren't either. I wasn't alone. I compiled everything. The audio, the testimonies, the timeline. But still, I said nothing to Paul or my parents. I let them live in their comfort, in their arrogance, in their belief that Daniel would stay silent, would absorb the wound like he always did. That was the most delicious part. Watching them carry on, not knowing the tide had already turned. Watching Paul post smiling photos online like nothing had happened, while the audio file was quietly passed to key executives in his company. Then came the leak. I didn't publish it. I didn't need to. I sent it anonymously to 3 news outlets, ones known for covering ethical misconduct and leadership hypocrisy. I knew at least one would bite. 2 did, and within days, Paul's voice, mocking a child, assaulting her, calling women useless, was headline news in our city. He was asked to step back from his public duties pending review. Then came the corporate distancing, and then silence from him. Still, I said nothing. I didn't gloat. I didn't call. I didn't reply to the panic text he sent me. Did you do this? I didn't need to. He already knew. Not because I told him, but because in his heart he knew there was only one person in that room capable of quiet, intelligent justice, the one he thought was too weak to ever fight back, the one he slapped without touching. The fall was slow, but it was thorough. First, Paul's firm issued a public statement about reviewing conduct inconsistent with company values. Then he was placed on indefinite leave. Not fired, not yet, but that didn't matter. The news had already rippled. His clients backed away. His speaking engagements were cancelled. Sponsors ghosted him. The man who once mocked everyone else for being too sensitive was now suffocating under the weight of his own voice. It was poetic. My parents called the day after the news broke. Not to ask if Eliza was okay, not to apologize, but to scold me. Why would you want to destroy your own family's name like this? My mother asked, her voice tight. He didn't mean it. He was just frustrated. I felt a chill crawl through me. Not anger, not even hurt, just confirmation. They hadn't learned a thing. They still believed silence was strength. They still believed protection meant pretending nothing happened. I told them one thing: if protecting the family's name means betraying my daughter, then your name doesn't deserve to survive. And I hung up. That was the first time in my life I'd chosen truth over tradition. It didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like rebirth. I wasn't trying to punish them. I was trying to free myself from a legacy that had always demanded loyalty but never earned it. Paul tried to call several times, left voicemails ranging from defensive to apologetic to outright threatening. I didn't answer. There was nothing to discuss. The moment he hit my daughter, he forfeited the right to explanation. My silence was his verdict, and it was far more powerful than any insult I could have shouted back, because silence, when backed by truth, becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. Eliza slowly returned to herself. She'd flinch at loud voices for a while, but one evening I walked past her room and heard her singing again, off-key and loud, just how she used to, and I sat outside her door, hand over my mouth, tears in my eyes. That sound meant healing. That sound meant she hadn't internalized their shame. That sound meant I had done what I needed to do, not for revenge, but for her freedom. And Paul, he vanished from the public eye, deleted his accounts, moved out of his city apartment. Rumors swirled, but I didn't follow them. I wasn't tracking his fall. I was tending to our rise, mine and Eliza's. I wasn't interested in watching him suffer. I was interested in watching her thrive, and she was, because I had chosen her dignity over their silence. It's strange how quiet justice can echo louder than any courtroom verdict. I never filed a lawsuit, never confronted Paul in front of the family, never demanded an apology. I didn't need a scene, I needed peace, and as the dust settled, I realized something. When you stop asking for understanding from people who have no interest in growth, you begin to reclaim your power. My parents stopped calling. That silence used to hurt. Now it felt like freedom. The rest of the family started picking sides, but most stayed silent. A few reached out privately to say they were proud of me, that they'd seen Paul do things like this for years but didn't know how to speak up. I didn't judge them. We were all raised under the same rule: keep the family clean, no matter how dirty it gets inside. But now the silence had a crack in it, and through that crack light was pouring. Eliza started asking questions. She's a curious soul, like I said. She asked me why people let things happen when they know they're wrong. I told her the truth. Because standing up is hard when your survival has always depended on being liked. She nodded slowly and then said, "I'm glad you stood up, even if it made people mad." That one sentence made every step worth it. Her world will now be built on truth, not fear. Paul's collapse continued quietly. A colleague told me his company let him go for optics, and that he was considering moving out of state. I didn't smile when I heard that. I didn't rejoice. I just took a deep breath and felt the final piece of weight lift off me. I had no interest in ruining him. I was only ever interested in protecting what mattered most: my daughter's sense of safety and my own self-respect. Eventually I got a letter in the mail, handwritten, from Paul. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was more of a plea for explanation. "Why did you do it like that?" he wrote. "You humiliated me." I read it once, folded it up, and put it in a drawer I don't open often. He still didn't understand. He thought this was about him. He didn't realize the real story was about the girl he slapped and the man who finally stopped protecting the wrong people. I didn't need to reply. His life had already answered for me. His actions had already spoken loud enough. And my silence was not revenge, it was release. The storm had passed, and what remained was something stronger than rage or victory. It was clarity. It was peace. Months went by, seasons changed. The family fractured in ways I never thought it would, and yet I didn't grieve it the way I expected. Something about losing people who were never truly with you feels less like loss and more like alignment. Eliza and I moved forward. I took time off work. We traveled, not far, just small weekend escapes. Forests, coastlines, quiet places. I wanted her to remember what safety feels like, not just in body but in spirit. She healed in layers, not with grand declarations, but with small signs. She laughed more. She asked hard questions and didn't flinch when the answers were messy. She even asked if I'd ever forgive Paul. I told her the truth. Forgiveness is something you give when it no longer costs you your dignity. And then I asked her if she would ever forgive him. She was quiet, then said, "Maybe when he becomes the kind of man who knows what he did." That moment told me she was growing in ways my parents never allowed us to, with honesty, with compassion, with boundaries. We weren't just recovering from a slap, we were recovering from generations of silence. And somehow, she was leading the way. Her voice had returned, stronger, wiser. The very thing they tried to silence had now become the most beautiful part of her. As for me, I took stock of my own life. I looked back at all the times I'd been the one to smooth things over, to absorb the shock so others wouldn't have to deal with their mess. And I realized how much that had cost me, not just in energy, but in identity. I had built my image around being the steady one. But strength without truth isn't strength. It's submission. Paul stayed quiet. The last I heard, he'd taken a job in another city. Something far below what he once boasted about. His fall wasn't spectacular. It was slow, hollow. A man walking through the ruins of his own arrogance. He still hadn't reached out again, and that was fine by me. Some stories don't need sequels. Some endings are meant to stay quiet. And peace, it came gradually. Not all at once, like a sunrise, but more like the fading of a storm. I found it in morning coffee with Eliza, in the way she started playing piano again, in the way she stood taller in school photos. The world hadn't changed, but we had, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that is the victory. One morning, I received a message from a woman I didn't recognize. She said she had been at the anniversary party that night, one of the guests near the back. She thanked me, said what I did, gave her the courage to speak up in her own family, where a similar kind of quiet cruelty had lived for years. I stared at that message for a long time, not out of pride but out of awe. Truth spreads when one person dares to stop pretending. I shared it with Eliza, and she smiled. "You helped someone without even talking," she said. The irony wasn't lost on me. My silence, once used to keep me small, had become a tool for something far greater. Not silence as surrender, but silence as a statement, and through it, others were finding their voice. I didn't set out to inspire anyone. I just wanted to protect my daughter. But maybe the two aren't so different. Eventually the holidays came. Normally we would gather with the whole extended family, but this year Eliza and I made a different plan. We invited people who made us feel seen, friends, neighbors. Even the venue staff from the anniversary dinner, We shared stories, laughter, and warmth that didn't need to be earned by silence. There were no cruel jokes, no hierarchy of power disguised as tradition, just presence, just peace. That night, after the dishes were done, Eliza sat across from me, cradling hot cocoa in both hands. "You know," she said, "I thought what happened would make me scared of people forever." She paused. "But now, I think it just made me better at seeing who's worth trusting." I swallowed hard. She didn't just survive, she grew. She alchemized that pain into discernment, into power, into wisdom. I realized in that moment that the real revenge wasn't in what happened to Paul. It was in what didn't happen to us. We didn't stay small. We didn't shut down. We didn't become like them. That's the quiet, holy kind of justice no headline will ever capture. The kind you live, not just win. And I stopped feeling like I needed closure. Because sometimes, the best closure is no longer needing an apology, just living well, fully, and free. Months later, I was asked to speak at a local conference. The topic was power and integrity in leadership. I nearly declined. I'm not a public speaker. I'm not flashy. But the organizer said they'd heard what happened, how I handled it, and they wanted my story shared. I thought about Eliza, about the woman who messaged me, about the next person stuck in silence, unsure of what to do. I said yes. I didn't mention Paul's name. I didn't need to. I spoke about legacy, about the cost of protecting reputations instead of children, about the danger of mistaking fear for respect. The room was still. You could feel people processing their own stories in real time. When I finished, a man approached me and said, "You didn't just tell a story, you gave us permission." That's when I understood what I had really done. I hadn't just responded to a slap. I had broken a curse, the kind passed down through generations, fathers teaching sons that power means control, mothers teaching daughters that silence is strength. Eliza would grow up knowing a different truth, one where love doesn't hurt, one where dignity isn't negotiable, one where protection doesn't come with a price. I started mentoring a few young fathers after that, quietly, privately, not because I'm perfect, but because I've been through the fire and came out knowing what not to do. I told them, the way you respond when your child is hurt, that becomes their blueprint for self-worth, and I meant every word. Our children don't need us to be flawless. They need us to be present. Paul remains a ghost. Occasionally I'll hear his name in passing, always with a whisper attached, but I don't flinch anymore. He's just a shadow now, a warning, not a wound. And I carry no hate, only memory, the kind that sharpens your values and reminds you why your silence must never protect the wrong side again. And Eliza? She just turned 13. She still talks too loud. She still fills every room she walks into. And I've never loved anything more. A full year passed since that day. Eliza and I lit a single candle in the backyard. No reason, no holiday, just a quiet ritual. I asked her, "Do you remember what happened?" She nodded. "Yeah, but I don't feel it anymore." That's how healing works. Not by erasing, but by releasing, by living so fully forward that the past has no choice but to fade. Sometimes I look at photos from that anniversary, not to reopen wounds, but to remind myself how far we've come. In those pictures, Paul is laughing. My parents are proud. And I am invisible, standing off to the side, smiling politely. I don't recognize that man anymore. And that too is victory. People ask me now if I regret how I handled it. If maybe it was too far, I say no, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood something vital. Silence is not neutral. Silence sides with the loudest voice. And in that moment, it was time to change the speaker. I've learned to live in alignment. to let my peace speak louder than my fear, to protect with wisdom, not wrath, and to love in a way that never asks someone to shrink themselves just to keep the family from falling apart. Eliza taught me that. I gave her life, but she gave me something far more sacred, truth. And so, here we are, not heroes, not victims, just two people who chose a better path when the worst side of tradition showed its face. My story isn't about vengeance. It's about dignity. And dignity, once reclaimed, becomes a fire that never dies. And that fire, it lives in both of us now. It's been long enough that people have moved on. Paul has a new job. My parents have rewritten their own version of events, as people often do. But I don't challenge it. I don't need to. The truth doesn't need defending when it's already rooted in your life. Eliza came home from school one day and said her class was discussing family values. She raised her hand and said, "Sometimes family doesn't protect you, and that's okay. You can still grow anyway." Her teacher emailed me, said she had never heard a child speak with such clarity and poise. I read that email 4 times, cried once. We still have family, just not the one I was born into. We've built our own quiet, kind, resilient, people who value honesty over comfort, people who don't flinch when truth walks into the room. It's a smaller circle, but it's real, and real is enough. Paul never apologized, but he doesn't have to anymore, because I don't need it. His silence is its own kind of confession, and my peace is the only answer I've ever needed. So if you're listening to this, and you've been told to keep it in the family when someone harms you, I'm here to say don't. Protecting someone else's comfort is not worth sacrificing your soul. Truth has a weight to it, but so does silence. And one of them will bury you. Not long ago, Eliza asked me if she could write about what happened for a school project on courage. I hesitated, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want her to carry something that wasn't hers to hold. But she looked at me with those clear, brave eyes and said, "If I write it, it won't be mine anymore. It'll be out." I gave her my blessing, and what she wrote moved even her teacher to tears. She didn't describe the slap. She didn't focus on the humiliation. Instead, she wrote about standing beside someone who stood up for her. She wrote about love that doesn't flinch, and how courage sometimes looks like saying nothing while doing everything. She ended her paper with one sentence: "I learned that silence can hurt you or heal you, depending on who controls it." 13 years old, and already wiser than most adults I've ever met. That's when I realized this story didn't belong to me anymore. It had rippled into other hearts, passed through other doors, and become a kind of permission for people who had none before. I didn't mean to start something bigger, but I did. And it's humbling to watch a moment that once felt like devastation become something quietly, wildly redemptive. I was recently invited to join a panel on family systems and generational trauma. It's funny how one night of betrayal can open the door to a whole new life's purpose. I said yes, of course, not because I'm an expert, but because I'm a witness. A man who once believed silence was a virtue until he learned it could be a weapon. At the panel, someone asked me what I'd say to my brother now, if I had the chance. I paused for a long moment, then said, nothing. Because the man I would have spoken to never really existed. And that's the thing with people like Paul. They live in a version of reality where consequences feel like cruelty. But truth doesn't harm. It reveals. And once something is revealed, it can never go back into hiding. That's the difference between pain and purpose. One traps you, the other frees everyone else. So this is where my story settles, not in revenge, not even in justice, but in truth. And truth, I've learned, doesn't need to roar, it only needs to stand. I stood for my daughter, I stood for my younger self, and without knowing it, I stood for 100 silent voices in that banquet hall who were just waiting for someone to say, enough. Eliza is thriving now. She doesn't carry fear in her body the way she did that night. She still gets loud when she's excited. She still interrupts at dinner to tell me about a book she's reading or a friend who made her laugh. Every time she does, I thank the universe that her voice survived, that it wasn't stolen by a single cruel moment or by the people who laughed after it happened. As for me, I live simply. I go for walks. I write. I mentor. I cook dinner most nights, badly but with heart. And sometimes when the house is quiet and the windows are open, I hear her humming in her room. Not a song I recognize, just a sound of life moving forward. It's the greatest sound in the world. I don't check in on Paul anymore. I don't ask about my parents. They made their choices, and so did I. I chose my daughter's voice. I chose self-respect. I chose quiet, deliberate action over the illusion of family unity built on denial, and I would choose it again, every single time. So if you've been silent for too long, if you've watched someone hurt the ones you love, while the world expects you to smile and stay polite, this story is your permission slip. You don't need a stage. You don't need applause. You just need clarity. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is turn on the microphone and walk away.